Welcome to Tech Brothers. In this video, we're going to learn how to install or configure SQL Server in active-active cluster mode. In this demo, we'll be learning what makes MS Windows cluster active-active. Number 2, configuration of SQL Server in cluster mode. Number 3, SQL Server cluster mode installation requirements. Number 4, we'll be talking about service account permission requirement. Number 5, we'll be taking an overview on cluster shared disks and best practices. Keep in mind, I have written a note right here. I have put together another video about active-active and active-passive cluster configuration overview, and that video really gives you much more detail about active-active and active-passive configuration in general, and active-active and active-passive cluster configuration when it comes to SQL Server. But I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but mostly I'm going to go ahead and talk about the configuration part, that what makes SQL Server active-active when it comes to MS SQL Server cluster. So I have put together, I've used this little snapshot right here in my previous video. If you notice right here, in general, active-active configuration, and up here there are a couple properties of active-active. What makes active-active is that if server 1 goes down, everything that's running on server 1, these servers up here will take over on that, and once they take over that, up here it would be they will share the resources. But if you take a look at the bottom up here, active passive, that we install applications on active nodes, and they have a failover node, and in active passive this guy is sitting doing nothing when everything is going okay between these active nodes. But another picture right here, this is a little architecture I have for my MS cluster in terms of SQL Server. So the first node, I have two nodes cluster, Tech Brothers node 1, Tech Brothers node 2. So the first node up here, I have installed one SQL Server instance. Right now it's running in active passive mode, which is that TBS node 1 has SQL Server instance called SQL prod, and something happened to node 1, everything will fail over to node 2. Now let's talk about that other instance. Let's say that we have a requirement that we need to have another SQL Server instance that needs to be in high availability too, and we decide that, oh, okay, we do have MS cluster already installed and it has already enough physical resources. What we can do is we can install another instance of SQL Server. Now there are two options doing that. Number one, that you go ahead and install another instance on the same node and make this node a failover. What will happen in this case is SQL Server prod and SQL UAT, these SQL Server instances will be active passive mode right here. Now in order to make active, what we will do, we will have SQL Server prod installed. This is the primary SQL node for this SQL Server prod, this instance, and we will go ahead and install SQL UAT on this box as a cluster, and this will be the primary node for our other instance, which is SQL UAT. So this server right here will be active running this instance, and this server node 1 will be active running this instance. So in this configuration, we call it, at the first look, we call it, this is active configuration, because one of the property of active configuration is that all the servers in active configurations, cluster configuration, they're responsible for their own applications. They run their own application, even though they do have communication, and they can, the second property is they can share the resources. But in this case, they don't really share the resources as far as physical resources, CPU, RAM, and all that. They don't share that, but they are responsible to run their own application. And that is one part that makes it active when it comes to SQL Server being on two node cluster in MS cluster. And the other part that makes it high available, because you can have two servers, and if this server, if you haven't configured failover for this server right here, which is running SQL UAT, then it's not gonna be available all the time. In order to provide the availability to this part, what we do is, even though this is the primary responsible for running this SQL Server UAT, we define node 1 failover of this guy right here for this instance. This would be the failover, and vice versa for this SQL Server instance if I take it right here, and this would be failover for this instance. Now keep in mind the main magic up here is that this SQL prod is node 1 is responsible mainly to run this SQL Server instance right here, and SQL UAT instance will run on node 2. So under normal circumstances, these servers will not be sitting idle. They will be basically running their own applications, and in this case the applications are different SQL Server instances, and this server will be prod, and this server will be running UAT instance, and a high availability will be provided. Once this server goes down, this server is capable of running these both instances because we went ahead and we defined the failover. So what I mean when I talk about failover and difference between in general cluster and MS cluster when it comes to SQL Server is that you have to define the failover. Normal in general failover, you don't define the failover. The SQL the servers that's in the cluster, they decide that who's going to run the application that has the server that has gone down. But in this case, we define the failover that okay, if this server goes down, hey node 1, please take over on this. This is just 2 node scenario, but if you wanted to put more nodes in there, the same scenario remains intact. So what happened is that you have to define the failover. Even and other characteristics that as I said, that active is that they're running their own application. So basically, back behind the scene, this is the main idea when people say that you know, what's the difference between active and active passive configuration when it comes to SQL Server. That means is really that SQL Server one instance is running on one server and other instance is running on other instance. Even though after the configuration these are capable of you can move this right here, this resources on this server node 2, and all the resources on node 1 node 2 you can move it to node 1. But there are a couple configuration that makes it automatic active. Number 1 right here, the first thing that makes it active is that we define something called preferred node. So in preferred node, what happened is we define that SQL Server SQL prod, this instance is supposed to run on node 1. So we define in our configuration that this is this preferred node, and we define that SQL UAT is supposed to run on node 2. So that is one configuration that makes it the preference that I would like to run it on node 2. Since node 2 is down, okay, I'm running on node 1, that's okay. But other instance, other property that makes it or configuration I should say, that makes it possible for us to make sure that they run on their preferred node if they are both really up. If both nodes are up in this SQL Server cluster or in this Windows cluster, then we want to make sure that SQL prod runs on this node and SQL UAT runs on this node, and that is called you have to define like automatic failover. So in once these two properties or configurations are defined, what happen is, let's say server node 2 has gone down. So node 1 has SQL prod and SQL UAT, these two instances running. As soon as node 2 comes up right here, node 1 says, hey, your node is up, I cannot run your application anymore, go back home. So this property right here, automatic failover, defines that. So these couple of configuration that we will do in our cluster, but I wanted to make sure that you understand the idea behind active configuration when it comes to SQL Server or MS cluster, and how different they are in general concept of active and active passive cluster configuration. Now what I'm going to do is, I already have a SQL prod installed on this node, and I'm going to go ahead and install SQL UAT instance on this node right here. And once I install, mainly I will install on this, and I'll make the failover node 1. I will make failover of node 2 right here. This guy I'll make failover. So TBS node 1 will be failover of node 2 and vice versa. So this is what this is how I'm going to accomplish to make you understand that when we talk about active and active passive configuration. So if you notice right here, I have two node cluster, TBS node 1, TBS node 2, and let's go ahead and take a quick look on TBS node 1 and take a quick look of our cluster configuration. So we'll go ahead and failover cluster manager, fire up that. As you can see that in my case TBS 2012 cluster, this is the name of the cluster, and if we go in the roles, you will see two roles right here. One is DTC, distributed transaction coordinator, and other is SQL prod. So right now the owner of SQL prod is node 2, but what I'm going to do is bring SQL prod to failover to node 1, because later on I'm going to define it that node 1 will be the preferred node for SQL Server prod. So I'm going to go ahead and move the resources to node 1, and I'm going to go ahead and move DTC resources to node 1 too. Basically what I'm trying to do is move everything to node 1, and then I'm going to go ahead and install another instance on node 2 and make node 1 the failover for node 2. And if you notice right here, we have two nodes, both are up, TBS node 1, TBS node 2, and I'll come back to the configuration that how we can make it possible that if both nodes are up, we want to make sure that one instance of SQL Server which we made node 1 primary should run on that, and other instance that we installed we made node 2 primary, it should run on that. But let's take a look on the disk. Right here, these are the separate disk I have put together. This is DTC, and this is the quorum for our cluster, and this is for SQL Server. One is this is TempDB, and this is for log, and this is for data. And keep in mind, these three disks I'm using for SQL Server instance SQL prod. If you wanted to install another instance of SQL Server, you need to have another set of shared disks, and all those shared disks needs to be basically added into the into your cluster. So this is a quick overview of the right now what we have, and next thing what I'm going to do is go ahead and add all those disks. I have already created shared disks, so I'm going to go ahead and add those disks to our cluster. So if you right click on add disks, you will see that disk 6, 7, and 8, they are available up there for us to add. We're gonna go ahead and click OK, because these are the disks that we're going to use for our SQL Server, second instance of SQL Server. Alright, the 6, 7, and 8, these are the shared disk has been added, and up here what we're gonna do is UAT data. As you can see, volume right here. If you click right here, this is UAT TempDB, and if you click right here, this is UAT log. So these are the three disks that we're going to use for another SQL Server instance. So this was a quick overview of shared disk. I do wanted to mention that it is best practice to have data and log on separate disk, and also the TempDB on separate disk. So these are the best practices as far as the shared disk goes. So we have these three disks to install our other instance. So we're gonna go ahead and go onto our node 2. So I'm going to go ahead and node 2. If I go over here, and I have SQL Server 2012 instance installation right here, the media. So I'm going to go ahead and open it and run setup as administrator. So if you click on installation, you will see that we had two options when we used two options basically when we install SQL Server in failover cluster and add a node or create a failover for that particular SQL Server instance. We use these options. One is on primary node. You basically go ahead and run SQL Server failover cluster installation, and on another node you will run add node to SQL Server failover cluster. Basically, when you click on this option, you are creating a failover of a cluster of a SQL Server instance that you just installed on one of the active node that you call it active basically. So what we're going to do, since this is going to be another instance, and it is going to this node 2 is going to be active node for this SQL Server instance, what we're going to do is go ahead and click on SQL Server failover cluster. This is on primary wizard that we wanted to run, and let me quickly show you that what we require as far as this is the checklist that I'm using for this whole playlist. And if you notice that in any instance that you install on cluster, you need to have a static IP. In my case, I have used 192.168.164. That is for SQL PROD, that already instance that I have installed, and I'm planning to use another IP, static IP, which is 65, 192.168.1 and 64. And if you take a look quickly on my up here, I have IP addresses right here, because all the static IP addresses that I have used so far I have put down here, and I've used this architecture, my little architecture of a cluster with you in previous videos as well. So let's go back to node 2, click OK. You can go ahead and basically skip scan, and what it's doing is it's checking online, include SQL Server product updates. If there are updates available, it'll check. So we're gonna go ahead and click next, and it's installing some setup files at this moment. We have just one warning, which is network binding order. We know that last time we checked that binding order is correct, so I have made sure that binding order between private and external network is correct. So we're gonna go ahead and click next, accept the license, click next, and we do want to choose SQL Server feature installation. Click next, and we wanted to install SQL Server engine and management. Up here, everything is already installed. Client tool connectivity, that's one thing that we want to make sure that we install that. I would always recommend that don't install reporting services, analysis services, or integration services in the cluster installation right now. Install it separate, otherwise you will run into a lot of issues if you install it, even because they are not cluster aware. So if things are not cluster aware, it's better to basically install them separately rather than in the same installation of SQL Server engine. So I'm going to go ahead and click next. Click next. And this is SQL Server Network right here. Let me show you quickly. Go back to this. Up here, this is SQL Server Network. I have used this TBS SQL cluster right here. I'm going to go ahead and use up here TBS SQL UAT / SQL UAT. This is a SQL Server Network. When you open from Management Studio, you will basically connect with SQL with the network name plus the instance name. Cluster network name, SQL Server cluster network name plus the instance name. So I'm going to go ahead and use that. This is going to be my network name. So I'm going to go ahead and call it SQL UAT. Click next. Click next. And these are the disks that's not available right now. Just a SQL Prod M and DTC. There are some of the disks that's already taken. And this is the SQL Server cluster resource name right here, SQL UAT. Click next. And these are the disks that we do want to use, so select all of the disks. Keep in mind that these are the disks that we just added for this SQL Server instance. So if you install more instances, you need to have more shared disks. So click next, and this is the IP address that you wanted to give. So click on IPv4, and this is what I was talking about, 192.168. This is the static IP address that you would give it to this SQL Server instance. So in my case it's 65. I have used 64 already. So if you ever use this IP address that's already being used, the installation is gonna fail, and it'll tell you that there is an IP conflict with that. So click next. And this is SQL Server Agent and SQL Server Database Engine accounts. Keep in mind, for production, SQL Server Agent account should be a separate service account, and SQL Server Database Engine should be a separate service account. In my case, I'm using Cluster Admin. That is the account that I'm using for SQL Server Engine and SQL Server Agent. However, I do recommend having separate accounts. And this account, the service account, should be, as far as best practices goes, and you can go in much more detail of permissions, but if you make these two, if you have separate SQL Server Agent account and SQL Server Engine account, make them sysadmin on SQL Server, and put them in administrator group of each node that is being used on this cluster. So that'll keep you from getting a lot of permission errors. Click next. And now you do want to choose mixed mode. If you choose just Windows authentication, your SQL Server will only accept connection from your Active Directory. You don't want to do that. Always try to install mixed mode unless you have requirement to just install it in Windows authentication. So in my case, I'm going to go ahead and select mixed mode. This will be SQL Server user authentication and Windows user authentication together. So here is the assay password. You do want to give a password that you would remember later on. I'm going to go ahead and click add current user as an admin. You can add more user if you wanted to give sysadmin on SQL Server any other user. So click on data directory, and you know that we have defined S for SQL Server data, R for SQL Server log, and T for SQL Server temp DB. So I'm going to go ahead and select that. This is SUAT data for this instance, and let me go ahead and basically copy this. So for this, we're going to go ahead and use R. Temp DB, we're going to go ahead and use Y for this instance, UAT temp DB. I'm going to go ahead and put that here too. Backup, we can leave it. I did not create a separate disk for the backup directory, but if you have a separate disk for backup directory, you can go ahead and give that right here. So click next. Click next. Next again. And these are the features what's just gonna install and what's already installed. So let's go ahead and click on install. Installation is going to take some time, so I'm going to go ahead and pause the video. Once the installation is completed, I'll be back. To our node 1, TBS node 1, that is going to be our failover for this instance. So let me go ahead and close this. Close this. I'm going to go ahead and eject this from here too, because I'm going to go ahead and use the same media on node 1. So let me minimize this. Let's open node 1. Mounted up here the SQL Server media, so let's go ahead and open SQL Server media. Right click on setup and run as administrator. As you can see that we're on TBS node 1, we're going to go ahead and create this node as a failover node for the instance that we just installed on node 2. For that instance, node 2 is going to be the primary and node 1 is going to be the failover for this particular instance. Click on installation, and this time, since this is going to be the failover, we're going to go ahead and click on this add node to a SQL Server failover cluster. Click OK. It's checking if there are updates for this product available. Right now there is none. Click next. Installing some set of files. And this is the server, that server instance name right here. Name of this is UAT, and we're going to go ahead and select this one because this is the server that we're creating the failover for, SQL Server instance. Click next. As you can see right here, TBS node 2 is the primary at this moment, and this is our IP address that we configured. This is static IP address of our new SQL Server instance called SQL UAT. Let's go ahead and click next. These are the service accounts. In my case, I'm using one account, but it's always a good practice to use a separate account for SQL Server Data Engine and SQL Server Agent. Let me make sure that I have put right password right here. Click next. Next again. Next. This is the summary right here of adding the node to failover cluster. Click install. Installation is going to take some time. I'm going to pause the video, and once the installation is completed, I'll be back. And after that, after the installation is completed, we're going to go ahead and check the failover for this particular instance, and then we will go through this some configuration on the cluster side, what I was talking about, preferred node and automatic failover, and we'll do some experiments on that. That failover cluster add node operation is completed successfully. Let's go ahead and close this and take a look on our cluster. I'm going to go ahead and open the cluster right here, cluster manager, failover cluster manager. You can use either node to fire up failover cluster manager and take a look on the cluster and the resources. Let's expand and look at the roles. Before that, we only had SQL Server prod instance installed, and now we installed SQL UAT. As you can see, it's online, and right now the SQL Server prod is running on node 1, and SQL Server UAT instance is running on node 2. So basically, if you look at this, both nodes are busy running their own application. So as far as active goes, this one characteristics of active is completed right here. As you can see, if you click on SQL UAT, go to properties, and up here you will see select preferred node, and I can go ahead and select preferred node for SQL UAT, SQL 2, and this will become the preferred node for SQL UAT. I'm gonna go ahead and cancel this. Basically, this is going to be a long video, so I will put together another video, but I just wanted to quickly show you that how you check that whether it's going to be how you change the preferred node. In SQL prod, I'm going to go ahead and select node 1 and go to failover. As you can see, the prevent failover sign right here option is on. What we're going to do is allow failback immediately, so that as soon as preferred node comes online, this guy will go to its preferred node. So so far this I hope that this demo helps, because next demo is going to be all about the preferred node and other configuration of cluster.